Hi friends, it's Annie Grace. I am out and about and it is kind of windy, but I'm not going to be in my office at all today, so I thought I'd do a live video out here and let's see if this works. Hopefully it'll be okay. So again, this is Annie Grace, author of This Naked Mind, and today I am answering a question from Claire. Claire wants to know, she says, I would like to hear what you think about triggers. For example, Friday nights or seeing certain friends, I can go from not thinking about alcohol at all to full-on craving because I've seen an image or I've heard somebody mention it. Honestly, I think if there were no external triggers, I would never even think about drinking, and it would be so much easier. I can relate to that. I think that when I first stopped drinking, and it was so surprising that I never thought about it, especially because most of my drinking ended up being by myself, often, you know, in my room, when I was on trips or home or whatever, and I thought, wow, if there was, I was just on some deserted island without alcohol and without advertising, without people who drank, I would literally never even cross my mind to even have a thought about alcohol. And I think that's because we have cravings and triggers, especially in the early days, and they can be pretty hard to deal with. But I guess first I'd say, Claire, like, what a blessing that you're not thinking about it the rest of the time, because that, I think, is a huge thing, and you're already so far kind of ahead of the game, so to speak. But you know, triggers, what's happening inside your brain when you have a trigger, it's a dopamine release, and the dopamine triggers, and it triggers that something is going to happen. It's anticipation for something. So I've talked before about, you know, Pavlov's dogs, and how initially what happened in that experiment is they would be ringing a bell, and the bell would mean food at that instant. And so the dogs would salivate for the food, and then they'd back up that bell to before they gave the food. And suddenly the dogs started salivating at the bell, not when they ate. And so they said, okay, our brains can be primed for something, and primed for getting some sort of food or reward or, you know, gratification. And that's what's happening with this, is you see something where it's Friday night, or somebody says something, or an advertisement comes on, and marketers are brilliant with this priming technique. I mean, they specifically, have you ever noticed how the beer is poured and there's all these bubbles and it's icy cold? And I mean, they do everything possible to engage your brain with that dopamine and with that trigger, to prime it, if you will, to desire a drink. And yeah, and it's so, we're walking all around, and this stuff is happening all the time. I think that one of the really interesting things about dopamine is you've primed your brain, and then if you're saying, no, I'm not going to do that, it leaves you pretty grumpy. And I think that's one of the harder things to deal with, is because it's this loop. You know, you've been primed, and your brain is chemically expecting a reward. And when you don't give your brain that reward, when you don't allow that to happen, you feel very put out. And it's this feeling of, like, if you imagine a kid, right? And you go up to this kid and you hold up this ice cream cone and say, oh, this is so good. Oh, but you can't have any. That kid probably is going to throw a little bit of a fit. At least I know my kids would. And it's the same thing that's happening, and we think, oh, well, we're adults, we're mature, we shouldn't have that. Well, no, this is neurological, this is chemical, this is happening inside your brain. It's not necessarily your fault. So you've been primed to want something, because, and all sorts of things trigger this dopamine response, from a picture, from an advertisement, from somebody mentioning it, from seeing a bottle opener to seeing a glass, you know, all sorts of things can trigger this dopamine response. And you know, the really interesting thing to remember here is that this dopamine response has to do with wanting and craving. It does not have to do with liking. So there was a study done, and this was a really interesting study. So there was two different sets of mice, and what they did with these mice is they bred them to be dopamine rich or dopamine poor. And how they did that is they literally took generations and generations of very similar mice, those mice that had basically the same DNA, and bred them with each other, brothers and sisters. Disgusting, I know, but anyway, after 10 or 12 generations, and mice breed pretty quick, so they got these mice that just generally have more naturally occurring dopamine in their bodies, and mice that have less naturally occurring dopamine. And the mice that had more naturally occurring dopamine were much more motivated to go after reward. So when dopamine happens, you become very motivated for whatever reward that is that's gonna, you know, engage, that you think is coming. And so they would be really motivated to go after food, really motivated to go after sex, really motivated to do all of these things that are rewarding to the mice pleasure circuit in their brains. And the low dopamine mice were so unmotivated to go after even food that they had to be nursed to stay alive. So they would let themselves starve because they had zero motivation. So dopamine has to do with wanting and motivation. But the really interesting part of this study is that when they actually fed these mice the food, and they measured this through different techniques, including facial expression, how much these mice actually enjoyed the food, even the mice that were starving, the mice who were dopamine rich, the mice who were motivated to go after that food, did not enjoy it any more or any less than the mice that were dopamine poor. So mice could have no motivation, no wanting for the food, but could enjoy the food and have a huge liking of the food. Equally, mice could have huge amount of wanting and craving for the food, but then when they're eating it, just have a normal amount of liking. So the really key thing that came out of this study, and that's important to remember with your triggers, is that wanting and liking are not the same. You know, they probably were for that first glass of wine, and maybe even then, I don't know, but like if you think of wanting and liking some ice cream, you want it and you like it, and it's together, and it's the same. What your experience with alcohol is, you're wanting something that you're probably not going to like. I mean, if you really liked what alcohol did to you all the time, which, you know, we're realizing we don't actually like it that much, that it's not all that fun, that it makes us tired, that it makes us cranky, that it makes us feel bad the next morning, that it makes us do things we don't want, that it makes us not remember the evening. You don't want it. You want it desperately, but you don't necessarily like it. So I think the things to remember with craving is, one, it's chemical. It is chemical. It's not real. And two, the thing that this chemical loop is leaving open is not something you're actually going to want. So you could even carry around like a little list in your wallet of the reasons that you don't drink, or what a drink is going to do to you. I mean, you can pretty quickly kind of reverse it, being like, oh yeah, that's a craving, but actually that's just going to make me tired and grumpy. And then try to get yourself to really want something else. You know, like I, for a while, was drinking Shirley Temples, which are, I'm sure, horrible for you. But they're basically Sprite and grenadine, and they just taste phenomenal. And so I'd order one with my kids, and I got a kick out of that. But anyway, I think that doing that, remembering that it is chemical, so it's not that you're really missing out. This is just something chemical happening in your brain, and what your dopamine is priming yourself for is something that you're probably not going to like anyway, because that's why you stopped drinking. That's why you don't even think about it when the dopamine isn't happening. And then I guess the last thing that I'd sort of say out of that, and I'll look at my notes here, is that you are able to form new neural connections. So neuroplasticity is something I talk a lot, and that's something that's relatively recently discovered. We used to think, although the Dalai Lama, I believe in the 1970s, said that our brains can change through thought, that we can actually change the structure of our brains through thought and form new physical neural pathways through the power of our minds. And he's been proven right through science. And we have the ability, by overcoming those cravings, by flipping them, by being conscious of them, by realizing they're just chemical, to actually form new neural pathways in our brains. And that means that over time, those cravings go away. Like I don't ever crave alcohol. I mean, honestly, like I can't even tell you the last time I had like a serious, like, oh yeah, I want to drink. It just doesn't happen anymore. And that wasn't the case early days. I was so happy to not be drinking, but equally, you know, that dopamine was happening. But over time, you know, a few years, and it's not that these things, all I'm saying is that this can and will change with your effort and your work. So be conscious of it, realize that it's chemical, realize that what you're wanting, what you're craving, this chemical craving, is not something you actually are going to probably enjoy. And then realize that the more that you do that, the more that you flip your thoughts, you are actually building new neural pathways in your brain that will completely release you from these triggers and cravings. So it was a really good question, Claire. I appreciate it very much. I hope everybody could hear me okay with the wind, and have a wonderful day. This has been Annie Grace with This Naked Mind podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can learn more at thisnakedmind.com. And please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, as it really helps us spread the word.